It's the Mark Larson Show. Good to have you with us here on this Monday. And the hard, cold realities continue. You heard the news through the course of the day that it's not quite as crazy, not quite as hot. Well, it's not quite as hot, period. I mean, we don't have the 100-degree-plus temperatures. But it's also not nearly as hot in some of the streets around the world with the protesters, the violence, the Death to America crowds, all supposedly inspired by this crummy little anti-Muslim film that was put together, it looks like here in Southern California, with an Egyptian Coptic Christian. And I got to tell you, the Steve Klein guy, Steve Klein, who keeps showing up in there, I used to know Steve Klein back in the day. He used to be in the same Sunday school class, adult Sunday school class, like 30 years ago. And when I saw him on television, he lives up in Hemet now, and supposedly he was a script consultant on this movie. And I thought, man, what has happened to him? First of all, we have freedom of religion. We have freedom for movie producers. We have freedom for pastors. We have freedom of religious leaders, one type or another, to practice their religion freely. And in America, you have free speech. So, you know, that guy, Steve, and his friend, this guy who was first called Sam Basile, whoever the people are behind this movie, in America, they have the freedom to do that. It's not good taste. And frankly, it's not good movie making. It was disingenuous. It was basically a con, even of some of the actors and actresses involved who reportedly had their words overdubbed by other people saying things they didn't say in the script. So there's all of that, but it's still, in terms of freedom, in terms of liberty, we're still free in this country to do dumb things, including making movies we may or may not agree with. I don't understand when you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, calling that pastor who supported the movie, the guy down in Florida, when you had him basically saying, back off on your support of the movie. Now, that's the same guy who says for a little publicity, he'll burn a Koran. Dumb stuff. Not the kind of thing you want to do to be sensitive to other religions, but we're still free in this country, aren't we? So there's a lot of things going on backstory that bother me. I think any time any particular religion in this country is attacked, you know, whether it's traditional or even when they go after Scientology, I have a problem with that. If government cracks down, it means government's getting more comfortable cracking down on religion. You can't just say, oh, that's just that group. No, because once you go there, they come for you next. History's proven that. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is back with us. He is, I think, the leading moderate Muslim voice when it comes to these issues. He's the author of the new book. We've talked to him about the book when it first came out, by the way. It's called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. And you find him as the founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Zuhdi, when you look at this, Doctor, you see all of what's going on here, and the extremists and the rhetoric and the way it gets played in Washington. What's the first thing coming to mind, or maybe grabbing your heart and gut as you experience this?
Well, I'll tell you, Mark, it's like we seem to have forgotten the whole principles of what America stands for. It's like there's riots against America, and America's response is to then censor itself rather than advance its ideas. And, you know, my family came here because we were able to practice our faith more freely here than any of the so-called Muslim world, and yet the very principles that Americans seems to have forgotten that are wedded to the freedom of speech and the freedom to offend is an inextricable relationship between the freedom to offend and the freedom to practice and worship. And once the government gets into censorship and film criticism, there's no end to that, because then President Obama should have been censoring Bill Maher's Religulous that offended all faiths, which he probably wouldn't do for obvious reasons. Then the government should be censoring the play in New York that's against Mormons, and all these other things. I mean, it's a slippery slope, and I'll tell you, as a Muslim, it offends me because we seem to be saying that, well, Muslims react like road rage, so therefore we're going to penalize the people that cut them off in the street rather than their reactions and treat them like less than human, and yet expect them to react with less rationality which I find actually bigoted, because we are the same values. We should have the same values and hold them to the same accountability that we do ourselves.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser with us, who, by the way, served in the U.S. Navy. Thank you for your service. I always like to point that out. You got the private practice as a medical doctor, physician in Phoenix. When you keep hearing this mantra that is in every AP story, every Reuters story, it goes something like this. Violence today in fill-in name of place here, caused by this movie. Even when the Libyan president says, well, at least on what happened in Benghazi, that's not so much how it happened. This is premeditated. How does it strike you? Does that really stir up? I mean, understanding the Islamic world, is that all it takes? Especially when most of these people protesting aren't exactly wired on Wi-Fi to see it.
Exactly, and it strikes me as they're playing us for fools. You know, the Wall Street Journal had a good piece today that talked about, it said the video did it, and they're right, it did not do it. There's so many layers to this, which is an information war, that they've been using these grievances. They have a list of millions of them, conspiracy theories galore, that they pull out of their quiver in order to find some Machiavellian foreign enemy in order to prevent modernization, prevent reform, and continue to justify the abuse of their own kids, their own families, their own population. And instead of the films that show YouTube clips of Assad destroying his people like animals in the streets, this film is used in order to justify the dictatorships like Assad and others. And if there's anybody dancing in the streets today about this film, it's the secular dictators that supposedly were the victims of this Arab Spring, because what we see this last week is not an Arab Spring. It's the Salafists, the fundamentalists, trying to hijack the Arab Spring.
You point out that Wall Street Journal, a lead editorial today called The Video Did It, and in that editorial they say this: it's one thing for the U.S. government to say it isn't responsible for and disapproves of an anti-Islamic video, but it's another to say the video is the reason for anti-American violence. 11 years after 9/11, 33 years after the Iranian Revolution, it should be obvious there is no end to the insults that Islamic radicals can imagine or cite as an excuse to foment anti-American, anti-Western protests and violence. And as you know, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser with us, who's just tuning in, Doctor, you bear the brunt of this as a moderate Muslim who doesn't say every time that there's anything in the news, let's go out and do something violent. It's got to drive you nuts as you try to defend your world of Islam compared to what the extremists have now made, I think, the definition for most people.
Oh, that's an understatement, because I look at this and I see a media narrative that feeds into this Muslim versus non-Muslim narrative, which is exactly what the fundamentalists want. And we ignore the fact that in Libya there were demonstrations pro-American after this incident that said these people don't speak for us. The Libyans want America here to help us with the peace. There were demonstrations of moderate Muslims that, not enough, but yet they're there, that there were 99% of the populations that didn't go to the street, that these demonstrations were only in the thousands versus the millions that happened last spring. And ultimately, we in America are actually, the reason tomatoes were thrown at the car of Secretary Clinton a few months ago was because they see us putting our finger up in the wind and not helping the weak liberals, the moderates, the reformists, and not standing with them and taking courageous stances with those that take the brunt of the force, but rather just trying to do a shortcut and working with, the enemies of our enemy and working with the shortest of those that say that they're for democracy, but actually just for elections and not for liberal principles. And they say that we're a paper tiger, and we're proving it over and over again.
We hear often in critiques of the Islamic faith is that, well, there really are no moderate Muslims like yourself, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, and they'll say that there's enough in the Quran that pretty much says if you're not in the Islamic faith, well, you're an infidel and you must die. So how do you defend that when people pull out the Quran and say, yeah, but what about this or that?
Well, anybody that knows my work knows that I realize and take ownership that we Muslims are still, in many ways, as far as this debate against or for modernity and against theocracy are in the 16th century, if not the 13th and 14th, that we have a lot of reform work to do. But having said that, there are not enough exposure to the reformists. We have a coalition called the American Islamic Leadership Coalition that includes over 20 different leaders of organizations, journalists, and writers that stand against the Brotherhood, stand against Islamism, and want platforms for reform. but yet it doesn't fit into the narrative that, the far left that wants to use Muslims as a checkbox, that they stand for minority rights, and then some on the far right that say that every Muslim is a possible terrorist and they're all about national security. And meanwhile, my book talks about the fact that the majority of us are looking for hope, looking for solutions, and looking for realism in the approach to this, that it's a Muslim problem, it needs a Muslim solution, but yet we cannot alienate the very faith that has to reform itself in order to come to modernity.
What is it going to take to reform the view in some of these countries where you've got unemployment rates skyrocketing? You and I both know how the extremists love to play on the ignorance, the illiteracy. It's the reason why the Taliban, for example, likes to burn down schools in Afghanistan, especially because they're teaching young girls. You make them more literate, they're not as easily led. What do you do to combat that? Or is that something that's just always going to be that way and we have to deal with it?
Well, it needs a strategy. It needs if you will, a kitchen cabinet session where we get together all the resources, private and public, and figure out what we're going to do over the next generation or two in order to help transform this tipping point into actual freedom. It includes a cooperation not only where you have at the head of the spear Muslim reformers, because if it's not built on the separation of mosque and state like the West was with church and state, it'll all be doomed to failure like the Iranian Revolution of '79 was. But with that foundation of reform, then comes free market reforms, the defeat of socialism, defeat of Arab nationalism and Arab tribalism, if you will, the defeat of various infiltrations of Russian ideology and corruption, Iranian corruption, Chinese infiltration into those areas. All of these need to be confronted, and there are so many programs out there. For example, the guy that won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2004, Muhammad Yunus, gave microloans to women's groups for small businesses that gave them the ability to separate in Bangladesh and Pakistan from their brothers, their fathers, their husbands, and be able to be independent. And you'll find many of those women, once they had financial independence, were able to interpret the Quran and interpret their faith in a modern light, separate from the theocratic, patriarchal tribal history that they had before that.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser with us, president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. His new book is A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. How often do you get heat from the extremes within your faith? I mean, because you're very bold, and you're probably the boldest one out there. I think you're a great voice for this whole debate and trying to say, wait a minute, we're not all the jihadists. But I got to figure you get some heat from people saying, what are you doing? That's not part of the gig here.
Oh, absolutely. And I get it from all ends. Get it from, I actually had a threat from the Syrian opposition radicals and Al-Qaeda on an Arabic website that was actual blatant threat that we had to deal with. We take our necessary security, but still, the comfort that I'm living in is just head and shoulders above that which many in the Middle East have to live in, and our families in Syria are suffering in. I get verbal attacks from Islamist groups like the Muslim Public Affairs Council that on 9/11 released a report saying that I wasn't qualified to quote-unquote have an opinion because I didn't have a degree in Sharia. And never mind that none of their leadership does, and never mind that they didn't deal with the substance. And really, that's what I want Americans to help us with, is to build platforms where we Muslims can have actual debates on the substance of what is Islam, what is not Islam, what's reform, what needs reform, what doesn't, and rather than talk past one another, force many of these Muslim groups to come to terms with their ideas and be accountable. And there are many of us Muslims that will take them to task and make it clear that it's not anti-Islam or anti-Muslim, which is how they try to avoid reform and marginalize the message itself.
Is that the kind of thing, Doctor, that is keeping more moderate Muslims like yourself from coming up and standing up and speaking up? You mentioned earlier there's some 20 groups, but, there are 20,000 groups or whatever the number on the other side of this. So what's it going to take to make more moderate Muslims who are where you are and talking about reform to step up and be counted?
And, Mark, that is the question that I hope people get out of this chaos that's resulted from this trashy film, is that the response to the attempt to suppress freedom of speech is what's going to either empower reformists and empower modernization and the pushback against the clerics, even here in America, where we have a laboratory to do this, or if we apologize for them and listen to their grievances and allow their grievances to have validity, then the moderates will be suffocated and we will end up, and that's why the opinion polls of America and the Middle East are so poor. they say that we don't stand for any common principles that we stand behind courageously and lead, but rather we just put our finger up in the wind and help whoever happens to be the least violent group of the day and the least anti-American, if you will.
Has the President of the United States been reaching out to you, Dr. Jasser, to say, hey, help us with this? How do we build these bridges? You seem to know what you're talking about. Have you had any of that from this administration?
No, not from this administration. None of our reform groups have been invited to any official functions at the White House. This is the first year, just 3 days ago, I actually did go to a State Department function for our holiday, and I was there Thursday, but I think that was because I was a Senator McConnell appointee now to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So in some ways they were obligated to invite me since I do have official capacity now in State Department. But, it's really upsetting to me that the political dynamic of the partisan polarity in America has prevented us from lifting up principles that we all share, left or right, and has continued to say that, well, the Muslim issue, we're only going to work with the left Muslims or those that will approve blindly of everything the Obama administration does, rather than those that actually are courageous enough to advance the principles of American freedom.
All right, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, always a pleasure. Appreciate the insight. The new book is Battle for the Soul of Islam. You can find that online, by the way. There's a website for the book, and then links up to all of his other entities there. battleforthesoulofislam.com. Thank you. Stay safe. I appreciate it.
Will do. Thanks,
right,
Mark.
More coming up. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser with us. And again, see, he's agreeing with me that little movie is an excuse. We have a right in this country to produce crummy movies. We have a right to the freedom of religion, and that includes people who endorse those crummy movies. Like this pastor down in Florida who likes to burn a Koran every week just to prove a point and get media attention, and he has, 12 people in his church. You have to have that freedom and liberty in this country, and we're losing some of that in the course of this while we're not watching. And the Obama administration would like us to believe that the reason all of this that's being inflamed by the Islamic extremists comes because of that movie. It's just the latest excuse, that's all. Movie's been out online since, June? And most people don't have Wi-Fi over there, so they're not exactly hanging on there and, doing their updates on Facebook. And, they get told by somebody, oh, it's horrible, go out there and do this. It's an excuse. And now the Libyan president says, as he said over the weekend, that if you think that was what caused the attacks that had deadly results at our consulate in Libya, that's outrageous. It's ridiculous. And he says that the administration, ours, is really, they're not on it. He didn't say clueless, but that's essentially what he's saying. You can't blame the video. It's just the latest excuse in the extreme world.